My name is Pat Peschman. I'm a volunteer with the Minnesota State Horticultural Society, and I'm here online tonight with Paul Richtman, who's going to be our speaker on tree care advice. Paul is a Washington County Master Gardener, a tree care advisor, and a University of Minnesota Ask Extension panelist. He's been teaching gardening classes for 20 years, focusing on pruning trees and shrubs and growing fruits and vegetables. Just a few housekeeping details before we begin. You are attending the webinar in listen-only mode, so you'll be able to hear our presenter and see him, but we won't hear or see you at any time during the presentation. If you have questions for our presenter or if concerns about how things are going with the webinar, you can put it in the questions panel, which you'll find on the right side of your screen. We'll be covering the questions at the end of the presentation. If it's a functionality issue, I'll respond to that as soon as possible. If you're not seeing the questions panel, look for the orange arrow on your screen's upper right corner. Click on that arrow and the panel will pop out and you'll be able to see it. There is no chat, it's only the questions panel. With that, I'll let you get going. Take it away, Paul.
Okay, thanks, Pat. Welcome, everybody. It's nice to see so many people interested in learning about trees. I think I need to move this out of the way here. Yeah, tonight I'm talking about tree care advice to keep your trees healthy and thriving. Obviously, this is presented through the Minnesota Horticultural Society. Now I got to get my advancer to go here. As Pat mentioned, I'm a volunteer with the Tree Care Advisor and Master Gardener, and those are two programs administered through the University of Minnesota Extension. And these are just briefly, I'll go over the mission statement if any of you might be interested in learning more about the program. So the mission for our tree care advisors is how to care for existing trees and how to selectively plant new ones. So we're all about taking care of trees and such, tree huggers, if you will. And then Master Gardener mission is to educate residents about research-based best practices in horticulture and environmental stewardship. So again, primarily helping home gardeners with their questions and concerns and techniques for whether it's vegetable gardening or perennials or shade gardens or ornamental grasses or trees or whatever. So a quick overview of what we'll talk about tonight. Benefits of trees, talk briefly about that, how to select a tree, planting, proper planting techniques, the importance of watering, growth defects and safety concerns, give you a little bit more information there on what to look for. I'll talk a fair number of slides on pruning, how to do it and why it's important. We'll talk about tree diseases and if it's too much to do as a home gardener, homeowner, will give you some advice on hiring an arborist. So getting right into it, benefits of trees. Trees provide shade, which is wonderful, especially on a hot day. It can provide shade to reduce your heating bill, shade the house, the patio, what have you, the deck. It's wonderful. Provide habitat for wildlife. Excuse me. Whether it's that shade for wildlife, or it's a tree for a bird to nest in, or a tree for a squirrel or a raccoon to live in, or any other such things as that. Not to mention provide a home habitat for many insects, which virtually all baby birds are fed insects, so they're beneficial to birds in that sense as well, having trees. Increase the property value. Obviously, a home with some trees around it is more appealing. Can create privacy if you have want some privacy, particularly in your backyard. If you got view of a roadway or the neighbors, trailer or something that's not real desirable, you can plant some trees to block that view. And then of course curb appeal. A home just looks nicer with some trees and shrubs around it. So how to select a tree? Right plant in the right place. Make sure it's winter hardy for here in Minnesota. You can buy trees online. You don't want to be buying trees from a supplier in Georgia or wherever and find out that it's not hardy in Minnesota. A soil is really important. So where you want to plant this tree, make sure you know what the soil is like, whether it's a heavy soil that tends to be wet, or it might be a sandy soil and dry, or maybe, you know, somewhere in between. Most trees are versatile, but there certainly are some trees that don't do well in dry climates, dry soil, and there's some trees that don't do well in wet soil. So make sure that the site you have, you find a tree that's going to fit those criteria. Size of the fit. Obviously, when you buy a tree, it's small relative to its mature size. So read the label or the literature on mature height. You don't want to put a 60-foot tree under a power line. You don't want to put a tree that might be spread 50 feet wide, 10 feet from the house. It's going to be rubbing up against the house. It's not going to look well as it gets bigger. So you want to look for that mature height and that mature spread when you're planning where you're going to plant your tree. Kind of a no-brainer, but you'd be surprised how many times that gets overlooked. And the mature height and spread is an estimate number. If it says, you know, 25 feet wide, budget a little bit more than that maybe, but don't assume that, oh, I'm going to put it 10 feet next to the house and then I'll just prune it to keep it narrow. That doesn't work. So trust that mature height literature and mature width literature and plan accordingly. And then of course, sunlight requirements. Some trees do well in the understory, so the partial shade under other trees. Most trees like full sun, so make sure you pay attention to that when you're selecting a tree. So some recommended trees to plant. This is one list. There's many other lists out there. First one on that list, I guess they're alphabetical, that's why it's there, but American elm. As most of you probably know, we've had devastation with Dutch elm disease. It's still around. What we have now is, these are three of them, Prairie Expedition, New Harmony, and Jefferson. These are three trees that have been, discovered that have survived Dutch elm. So then they've done some research and cloned them, grafted them, and realized that they have just some natural immunity to Dutch elm disease. There's also many other elms now that have been bred that have resistance. There's probably, I don't remember the exact number, 18 or 20 different elms now that are Dutch elm resistant. So elm is a great choice, especially now that we've had so much loss with our green ash trees. Bald cypress, I point that one out. That's a deciduous evergreen tree. It does really well in more moist, wet soils, but it typically grows in southern states, but it is hardy here in Minnesota, so it's a good choice. I won't read through all of these. A couple of them there, the chestnut crabapple and the serviceberry are two tree options that are shorter in stature, 15 to 25 feet tall, so good choice for under a power line, or if you've got some other overhead obstruction, those are good choices. Or maybe you just have a small space where you don't want a tree that's going to get too big or too wide. Lots of other choices there. And after this class, I will send out notes with this list, so no need to worry too much about getting all these jotted down, as well as that website there that'll be included in the notes. So decide what kind of a tree you want, or maybe you make a list of 3 or 4 that might fit your situation. Next thing would be to go to the nursery, or you could buy online. The trees are available online nowadays quite readily. It's going to be a potted tree. It's going to be at the nursery. You're going to buy online. It's probably going to be order this time of year, get delivery in April, maybe early May. It's going to be a bare root tree. Obviously, it's too costly to ship a pot of soil, and the risk of it getting jarred out of that, roots jarred out of that soil is highly likely. So potted tree would be local nursery. Baldwin burlap is a larger tree. It's harvested in the field with a larger machine, and there's a wire cage that goes around the ball, and then burlap to hold the soil in. It's going to cost you a lot more when you go with Baldwin burlap. It's a lot more work. It's heavy, but it is an option. Just wanted to mention that those are three options: a potted, Baldwin burlap, or bare root tree. The advantage of a potted tree is you can pretty much buy them anytime throughout the growing season, whenever, April, May through the fall. So when buying a tree, what do you look for? Well, obviously look for a high quality tree. You're going to pay a good price for this tree. It's kind of common sense, but look for a tree that looks healthy. You don't want a tree that's got wilted leaves or yellow leaves or some brown leaves or some broken branches. A few or that may happen, but don't go for the one that's the Charlie Brown tree. No bark damage. Obviously, you want to look closely at the bark. If the tree has been scraped up, maybe it's been handled poorly at the nursery, that's going to be a bad choice. And then ideally, that trunk of that tree is going to be centered in the pot. If it's off center, that tells you that root structure is not balanced. It's only going to be on one side, so that's going to be reflected on not centered in the pot. So look for that. And then once you purchase the tree, you're going to transport it home. It's really important to lift it by the pot, not by the trunk. You can disrupt those roots and really wreak some havoc if you're just manhandling it by the trunk. Sometimes pot's heavy enough that you need two people, one maybe handling by the pot and the second one to assist by one hand on the trunk to kind of help steer and guide it around. And then if it's later into the spring or summer when a tree is leafed out, you're going to want to, if it's not in an enclosed vehicle, if it's hanging out of the trunk or the back of the pickup truck, you're going to want to wrap the crown of the tree, those leafy portion, with a tarp or a sheet or some plastic or something, so that leaves don't get all beat up and knocked off of that tree on the drive home. So next would be planting a tree. You've picked your site, you know what the soil is like. Spring is a great time to plant trees. You can also plant in the fall, and like I said, with potted trees, you can pretty much plant throughout the summer. So dig the hole once as deep, excuse me. The depth of the pot, if it's in a pot, or if it's a bare root tree, you look to see where the depth of those roots. There's no need to go deeper than that. The risk of going deeper than that is that when you backfill that hole, that soil can settle uneven, and when the soil settles uneven, then the tree, which would have been planted nice and vertically straight, is now tilted or leaning. So no need to go deeper. Typically, roots grow out anyway once your tree is large enough to transplant. A little seedling has a taproot, but as the tree grows, the roots grow out, not down. So twice the diameter is a good rule of thumb, so that you have that soil loosened and all the same mix of soil. As your tree starts to grow, it doesn't come to this transition zone like, oh, this hole was backfilled with some nice soil, and now I come to this hard clay hard pan. There's certainly more detail on planting a tree, and that website, you can Google on that and read through that if you're need for more information. And then cut any roots that might be encircling the root ball. If a tree's been in a pot too long, those roots grow out, and sometimes when they transplant them into the pot, the roots are stuffed into that pot. They're longer than the 10-inch or 12-inch diameter pot, whatever it is. Might be a 24-inch diameter pot, but if the roots are more than that, then they kind of rotate them in there. If the tree is in that pot too long, those roots have a memory, and they start to grow around and around up against that inside pot. If you plant the tree with those roots still encircling like that, it's disaster. And the reason for that I'll get to, but you want to cut those roots. Now this photo shows somebody cutting the roots. Those are small enough not to be concerned. If the roots were larger than that, as a general rule of thumb, I say a root that's maybe the size of a pencil, standard pencil, should be cut. These look quite a bit smaller than that. They're going to flare out and do just fine. But any bigger roots that have that enough girth to them that they're not going to be able to change from that memory of circling around, you want to cut those roots off. This is an example of what a stem girdling root is. It's kind of obvious on this one. You can see those roots. You can see that pot, the size of the pot that it came out of. And surprisingly, but not surprisingly, if you think about it, as the tree grows, the trunk grows in girth, gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So this looks, by the look of the bark, it looks like a maple tree, nice gray, smooth, fairly smooth bark. As that tree, let's say it's that encircling root there is 10 inches in diameter. It's not that many years in a maple tree, the trunk can get to 10 inches in diameter. Well, if you have that encircling root there, that root becomes a strangulation point, and as the trunk grows, that root just compresses that outside of that root ball, the trunk of that tree, so much that eventually it kills it. We see way too much of this, and it could be that, like this example where it was pot bound and those roots were not cut. Those roots should have been cut before it was planted. The other thing that happens with this is when a tree is planted too deep, it gets some roots growing out of that trunk. Let's say this was buried another 4, 5, 6 inches above where we see those roots. It gets some new roots there, and they're not strong outward growing roots. They tend to just kind of cross over and lay against each other. Same thing can happen. It can strangle the trunk of the tree. So two important points there. If you've bought a tree that has encircling roots in the pot, be sure to cut them. Or the other thing is that when you plant the tree, make sure not to plant it too deep. And we'll talk about that here in this next slide or two. When you plant a tree, you're going to look for that root flare. What we mean by that root flare is those major roots that, as you can see in the photo there, pointing out with that finger, the roots that flare out to the side, typically at the base of the trunk of a tree. Not always real obvious, but the base of the tree, that stem, the trunk is broader, bigger diameter, and flares out where those roots are. That's what you want to look for. And those roots should be just like you see in this photo, right at the soil of the surface. Obviously, if you put mulch over them, that might hide that root, but right now you can see that it's right there at the surface. So no soil on top of that root ball. You can see over here, I believe you can see my pointer. You can see that even though after this is mulch, that there's the root flare right here is not buried in soil or covered with mulch. That's really important. So after you've planted the tree, you backfilled it, you're going to want to add some mulch around it, 2 to 4 inches. Wood chips are probably most common. Leaf mold or chopped leaves work well too. The leaves don't stay put as well as wood chips. Actually, the double shredded hardwood mulch is going to stay in place the best. And then you want to put it in what we say a form of a donut, not a volcano. Don't go by the strip malls where the mulch is mounted up against the trunk of the tree. That the research shows that is a problem for the tree. A couple things can happen. One, the trunk that's buried under that wood chip or leaf mulch, it can cause rot or decay, fungus growing on that bark, and it breaks down and then has a problem. Or the other problem can be that well, it's going to shed water if it's a volcano like that as well, or it may induce some root to grow out of there. And like I said on the previous slide or two, that stem girdling roots, if you got roots starting to grow out into that mulch, they're going to be bad roots, and they're going to cross over and tangle and strangle that trunk of that tree. So really important to put your mulch in this donut. What we mean by donut is a couple feet out is from the trunk, maybe that 4, 5, 6 inches next to the trunk, you have very little mulch. It's out further out or under the drip line. Then you're going to want some protection on that young tree. The bark is thin. primarily for rodents, rabbits, voles, beavers. If you live near a pond that has beavers or a stream that has beavers, that's not very common, but either chicken wire hardware cloth works well. There's good air circulation in there, but those pests can't get at to chew the bark. Really important. And then the winter months, so apply it in the fall and remove it in the spring. A white tube is the best. There's research has been done. A black tube would work, but black tubes don't fully work because they absorb heat. And what you're trying to do is protect the tree from sun scald. Sun scald is where this time of year, or a more normal year, maybe late March or into April, during a warm day, you get into the 30s and the sap starts to flow, particularly on the sunny side of the tree, south side, southwest side of the tree. The sap flows up there, and then all of a sudden the sun is blocked behind a cloud, behind another tree, behind a house, or what have you. And the sap that's in there freezes. And as you all know, when liquid water freezes, it expands. When it freezes and expands, it kills those cells. So it's very common to have bark damage on the south side of the tree, what we call a condition called sun scald. So that white tube on there shades the trunk. There's dead airspace in between it, so that even if that tube were to get warm, it's not going to be as warm inside there through that dead airspace. That's why we prefer not to use a black tube. If you happen to have a black tube, which is very common for a drain line, you could use that, but the recommendation is to paint it white. And then, as it says here, you want that protection through the winter, but take it off in the spring. And the reason for that is that, well, a couple reasons. Excuse me. The bark does grow, a tree does grow along the trunk, so it needs that light for photosynthesis. But the other one is when that sleeve is on there through the summer, it can again cause a high humid condition and fungal disease or decay or fungus growing on the bark. So remove them in the spring. Watering, let's talk about that. It's kind of obvious, but it is really important. I think everybody knows that when you plant a tree, you water it. You can water it either after it's planted, or you can, as you fill part where you can put water in. It helps to settle, remove any air pockets. Either way works. So we all know that, but do we all know that the research shows that we need to water it for 3 years? The first 3 years, it's growing new roots. How much do we water it? 2 gallons per caliper, inch caliper on the trunk. So let's throw some numbers at that to make it clear. If it's a 1-inch diameter trunk of the tree, 1 inch times 2 gallons is 2 gallons. The frequency is 2 to 3 times per week. So each time you water it, that couple 3 times a week, you're going to give it 2 gallons of water. A nice way to do that, inexpensive, if you got a 5-gallon bucket, drill 5 3/8 diameter holes in the bottom. In this case, we talked about 2 gallons, so fill that bucket about half full to about just under half would be 2 gallons, and let it seep through those 5 holes and slowly soak into that soil. You're going to do that 2 or 3 times a week. Soaker hoses work fine. Not as obvious as how much. You would have to have some experience with your soaker hose to know how much, in this example, how much 2 gallons is. Drip irrigation works well as well. And then you see these commercial bag or bladder types. Typically they're green, they got a zipper on the side. Same principle as a 5-gallon bucket. You fill it with water and then it slowly seeps into that soil around the tree. They work great, very successful. What you don't want to do is go out there with your hose and the sprayer and spray the top of that mulch, get it good and soaked in, and then realize later on that, boy, the mulch was wet, but not much water went down into the soil, that top 12 or 18 inches where the roots are. So You want to avoid that. And as I mentioned, the first 3 years, really important as that tree gets established. I think it's real common for people to water a tree when they get it, and then the next few weeks they water it, and then by the end of summer, they're maybe watering it once a week, put the hose on for a while and call it good. But no, it's really important the first 3 years. And as that second bullet says, through November until that ground freezes, it's really important to water that tree. Now, obviously, I think it's obvious if we get rainy weather and rain, get an inch of rain, that counts as an inch of rain on that tree. So you don't have to water it when the soil is still wet. If we've had a rainy week or a rainy 10 days, obviously then you don't need to water it. Always a good check is to poke into the soil. If a couple inches down, it's dry, it needs water. If it's still wet, a couple inches down, you're good to go. Let it go without watering. Okay, let's talk some nomenclature here to understand a little bit better how a tree grows and when we get to pruning, why that's important. So branch color, as you can see by those yellow arrows, it's kind of a swollen area where the branch is attached to the trunk of the tree. And this is really important because those cells in that branch collar are neither branch cells nor trunk cells. They're meristematic cells, which are comparable or equivalent of stem cells in the human body. So they multiply faster, they divide faster, they grow faster than the rest. So that's important to point that out. We'll talk more about that when we get into talking about pruning. The other bit of nomenclature I want to point out was the branch bark ridge. You can see along where that branch is attached, it's the bark has a ridge. It's not smooth. It almost looks like that those branches were a notch cut into the side of the tree, and then the branch stuffed in there and a bead of black or dark gray caulking put on it. Obviously, that's not the case. It's that bark ridge. So you can see that as that those branches and the trunk grow, that where the bark comes together, it pushes up as a ridge. That's really important to identify that ridge. So some growth defects and safety concerns when it comes time for pruning. A key to a strong branch is the crotch angle, and this shows a trunk and a yoke. That's not necessarily what we want to show here, but the angle of a tree, I always take my hand, and the angle between your index finger and your thumb is your four fingers would be the trunk of the tree, and your thumb off at that 45, 50, 60, maybe even 90-degree angle coming off from that trunk is ideal. Between your thumb and your hand is a nice U-shaped joint. As you can see, the U-shaped joint in this left photo, and you can see that bark ridge that I just talked about is pushing up, a little bit of a ridge there between them. By comparison, on the other side is like between your index finger and your tallest finger, you've got kind of a V joint, weak joint. A good windstorm and one or both of those could snap off. In this case, it's a double trunk, or more typically one would be a trunk and one would be a side branch, but V joint is typically weak. If you look closely at the bark in there, that bark is caught down in that joint, so it's not a very strong joint because part of the structure in that joint is just bark on bark. I'll show you some more slides to that. So this is what we're looking for, a nice wide U-shaped, again, picture your hand as the fingers on the trunk, and then your thumb where this branch is, or these two branches are growing off. A nice round U-shaped joint there is what you're looking for. Not all U-shaped joints are wide. This one is, I don't know what, maybe 30-degree angles off of vertical, so fairly steep, less than desirable in that regard. But if you look closely at that joint, it is a U-shape. It's going to have that bark ridge in there, so it's going to be a strong joint. Codominant leaders is another thing you're going to want to look for. In this case, this young tree has a single trunk up about whatever that is, 2 feet, maybe 30 inches. And then we've got a yoke, two leaders competing for top dog. This is a problem. And the reason it's a problem is because as that tree grows up, now this This mature tree shows 3, but it's got included bark in that joint more likely than not, and it's a weak joint. So when you have that young tree like that, I point that out because that's the kind of thing you're going to want to look for in a young tree to prune, what to prune. And center tree, that tree is way too mature. There's no way you could trim 1 or 2 of those off without misshaping the tree. You'd lose a third of the canopy, the leafy area of the tree. It would be a much lopsided tree if you were to prune it. Plus, you'd have a huge wound there. It probably would never heal over. But first one leads to this. Second one leads to this, where you've got included bark. You can see that dark area in both of these joints. This is decay. It's probably some rainwater getting in there, and because the bark is not sealed off, it gets in there and you get some decay. It's a weak joint, get a windstorm, and boom, you got a mess like this. Now this tree probably wouldn't die, it would probably continue to grow, but if you were to step back and look at it, it's probably literally a half a tree. It's all growing center or off to the one side. So not desirable. Probably this tree would be a loss just because it's not symmetrical any longer. So included bark, this is what it looks like. Instead of that ridge along the bark ridge, it's almost like 2 ridges or a pair of lips. The bark is tucked into that joint. Again, very weak. You're going to get some decay in here, and you just don't have the strong fiber of trunk to branch. So this can be a problem. And again, this is what happens. We saw that photo earlier. Other safety concerns are dead branches or hanging branches. You can see in this case, this branch has broken but not broken off. You want to trim out these broken branches before decay can set in. As well, they can be a safety hazard. This one's fairly small, but if they're bigger, can be swinging in the breeze or could fall on a person or a vehicle or such. So you want to prune out any broken branches. Diseased wood. This is an example of black knot disease growing on probably on a plum tree, something in the stone fruit family. You can control this. It's fairly common. You've probably all seen it. In this case, you would prune out the decayed part. You'd probably prune it back to where it's healthy, probably here at this side branch. Cut it off here and remove the decayed material or the diseased material. Rubbing branches lead to problems. You have rubbing branches. It scrapes open the bark there, and it's an open wound. It's not healthy for the tree. So remove one of those branches to eliminate that rubbing point. Which branch would you remove? It's your pick. Sometimes one branch is more, maybe this top one here would be the one to leave because it's a better attachment angle. Maybe this bottom one has more a share of the canopy, so you'd want to leave it that way. It doesn't matter which one, you step back and make that choice, but you want to eliminate one of them. Water sprouts and suckers. I'm sure you've all seen these. Suckers is probably the most common name for them. Technically, a sucker grows from the root out of the soil, and a water sprout, same thing, but growing off the side of a tree or where a branch has been removed. Very common. You want to remove those. I don't know that they're harmful to the health of the tree. They're just not desirable. You've got a nice shade tree in your yard and you got a whole bunch of suckers around, it doesn't look well. Or in the case of this locust tree on the campus of Minnesota, it's just a shaggy looking tree, so you'd want to prune all of those off. You can prune those any time of the year. It doesn't have to be in the late winter or dormant season. As they start to grow, come back or grow new shoots in the summer. When they're just a couple inches long, you can just grab them between your finger and thumb and snap them off. Or as they get a little bit more woody like these are, take a hand pruners and nip those off. So pruning, just a note on common sense here, know what you're doing so you don't do too much harm to the tree, and then if it's going to be dangerous, if it's too big or you're at all tempted to climb a ladder, that's way too risky for a home gardener, so hire a professional. Again, common sense, but it's worth mentioning. So the objective of pruning is to produce a strong, healthy, attractive tree. And then this objective can be understood, can be achieved by understanding why, when, and how to prune, and by following those simple principles. So let's talk about those. I hope I've simplified it enough so that not to overwhelm you, but at the same time give you some basic principles of what we're looking for. So I've talked about this good structure. That would be that crotch angle or attachment angle. It's determined during those formative years, those first early years, as you saw back on that slide with the 3 progressions. That young tree doesn't look all that bad, just that little, whatever it was, 1/2 inch in diameter where it had that yoke. But in your mind, know that that's going to grow up to like that center photo where you've got now a double trunk and it's a problem. A tree can recover quicker when removing young wood, so young trees grow faster. And as I mentioned, that branch collar area is also the fastest growing tissue. We'll talk more about that. Another picture of what we've talked about, desired structure, that attachment angle. This is out at the Arboretum. You can see these apple trees have a nice, strong structure. Again, that U shape in the joint, not a V shape. Seen this one. This is kind of a before. Those 2 leaders come in here and lop one off. Now you've got a relatively straight tree with a single leader. That is what you're looking for. As it says there, first 5 years, that's just approximate. Might be 3 years old, might be 7 years old, but when it's small and doesn't get too big, maybe a rule of thumb is a trunk that's less than 2 inches in diameter. So when a tree is young, it's the best time to remove these kind of branches. Here's an example of one that should have been pruned out. We've got this, I don't know what you'd call this maverick branch here is kind of growing up out of this adjacent branch, and then it's growing straight up vertically, competing for the center stem of this tree. Clearly this one should be cut out here. Not uncommon to see crazy things like this, and go ahead and prune them out. They don't belong there. Let's talk a little bit about the live crown ratio. That's the area of the crown, the leafy portion, the branch portion of a tree, and then the trunk. So the overall height. The equation for live crown ratio is the length of the crown over the overall height of the tree. And the rule of thumb there for deciduous trees, the shade tree should be 60%. So the trunk in this example would be no more than 40% of the overall height of the tree. Evergreens is less than that for the trunk portion. The live crown ratio would be 75%. So 25% trunk would be the maximum. We'll talk a little bit more about that live crown ratio on another slide or two here. So crown raising, this is a removal of those lower branches, and the goal of crown raising is for convenience or appearance. Got a couple photos to show that. Here's a nice big tall shade tree in the front yard, and you can see these lower branches, maybe what, 30 inches, 3 feet at the most off of the ground. Obviously you wouldn't have kids playing under here. It makes it inconvenient when you're mowing to have such low branches. So the rule of thumb is prune up to 7 or 8 feet, just so you're not knocking your head against it. Obviously, if the tree is only 10 feet tall, remember that live crown ratio of 60%. You don't want to prune up 8 feet on a 10-foot tall tree because you're violating that. But as the tree gets bigger and taller, you can strive for this 7 to 8 feet. If the tree is along the street, they recommend even taller than that, 12 to 15 feet. And this would be for like a panel truck or a garbage truck passing by. You don't want to snap off branches. So in this example, I would remove these lower branches here, probably showing, I don't know, 6 feet at this point. That's these primary lower branches, and there's kind of a gap here with no more. So you're probably ending up with 7 or 8 feet here of clear trunk. Again, for convenience, easy to walk under there, whether you're mowing or just walking by or playing in the yard. Here's a couple of large evergreen trees. Again, that live crown ratio for evergreens is a little bit different, 75%. So 75% of the height of this tree would be this area with green needles. You can see a person standing here. You can see that this tree is a very tall tree. There's probably maybe 3 to 4 feet under this one cleared. Wouldn't need to be that much. It's nice to have a minimum of a foot so you can get the lawnmower under there or the weed whacker, because oftentimes under an evergreen you'll get some volunteers, might be some box elder or some silver maple or some dreaded buckthorn or something. It's nice to have access in there to remove those. And then this example here, again, we shows how they violated the 75%. It's about maybe 60% of the overall height. Looks pretty ridiculous to me. It looks like a evergreen Christmas tree on a post. So we don't want to do this. Way too many. Now maybe there was good reason for this. Maybe this tree was diseased and was losing these lower branches. And this is just the way it ended up once they removed dead branches. If that's the case, so be it. At some point, you're going to decide that the tree just doesn't look good and you're going to end up removing it. So when it comes time to pruning, where to cut is important. It should be made so that only the branch tissue is removed. The stem tissue is not damaged. So proper pruning cut does not damage either the bark, branch bark, ridge, or the branch collar. Let's take a look at that, what that looks like. Here it is in a graphic form. So again, this is that branch collar, that swollen area, that meristematic tissue that multiplies and reproduces at a faster pace. You want to leave that there so that that tree can grow that bark, and it's going to look like this, kind of a donut shape, as that bark swells and grows over that removed branch. Incorrectly would be to make a flush cut like this, where you've damaged or removed this branch collar. That fast growing tissue has now been removed. So you've got this slow growing bark tissue, which who knows what's going to happen. Oops, went ahead there on me when I moved my cursor. You might have a little bit of growth on the side here where it's not quite as close, but top and bottom, because it was a flush cut, there's no branch collar, there's no live tissue there left in the bark. So it's gonna probably never gonna heal over. You want to avoid that. Again, leave that branch collar. Yeah, there's a protrusion here, but as this tree grows in girth over the next 3, 4, 5 years, this will kind of flush out, because that stump is not going to grow out anymore. It's just the tissue around it is going to kind of hide it, if you will. Here's a real photo of where you might cut if you wanted to remove this branch here. You cut it right here, leave the branch collar, this swollen area, and of course here's the ridge, bark ridge back here. Sorry about that. Here's a more mature branch. Again, that branch collar isn't real obvious, but it's in this area here, so don't make a flush cut. Leave the bark ridge and the branch collar will look like that. And again, this is an example of what it looks like as it heals over. Kind of has this donut look. That branch collar with those fast growing tissues are gonna enclose this over this wound in a few years. A dead branch, similar. You're gonna want to cut it off. Again, depends on how long that branch has been dead. This one has been dead so long that the bark is starting to fall off of it. You still want to remove it. You see oftentimes particularly on oak trees, a larger branch like this, maybe it's 3 inches in diameter, died, and usually you see it more in a woodlot than you would in a home lawn, but that branch has rotted away, and now it's rotted away such that there's a hole in the tree. So again, cut those dead branches off before that happens if it's in your yard. This is what it would look like when you're done. Looking closely at this right here, there was a little bit of damage to that branch collar, but the rest of it is all hard and dead bark tissue. So that's a proper cut there. By comparison, if you were to do a flush cut, a much bigger wound here, even though this would be the good cut, much smaller. This one's only twice the diameter, but if you remember, the area of a circle is times the square of the radius, so it's 4 times the area of this. So 4 times longer for this to heal over. And because it's such a big cut and the branch collar has been damaged, it's going to take even longer than that, if it even has a chance to heal over. So you want to, again, avoid the flush cut. See way too much, particularly in the strip malls. These so-called professionals that hired to trim trees around parking lots are atrocious in my mind. And the other thing you want to do is avoid a stub. This branch was removed. We got 2-3 inches here of branch that is now dead. You can see the bark is falling off of it. Not to mention, also here, this is what doesn't look like a bark ridge. It looks like that pair of lips, that's included bark. It's caught down in that joint. It's a weak joint. Bad scenario. Now, some trees, this happens to be a little leaf linden. Some trees are more prone than this to others, but you got to be cognizant of it. And if you see this on a smaller branch, that branch should be removed to avoid that situation. Again, this is what you want it to look like when it heals over. That donut has gone over to where it meets at the center and now eliminated an open area. And tree chopping, obviously, you typical homeowner is not going to be climbing up in a tree on power lines. Don't do it. All the experts agree, never top a tree. It's not good for the tree. Excuse me. You can see where this has been done a number of times. You had branches growing out of here. Power company has little choice. They need to maintain clearance around the wires. So if the power company had their druthers, they would cut this tree out completely. It's up to the homeowner or the landowner to decide whether that's the case or not. Oftentimes they don't want to lose the tree. It has some value maybe for privacy or in this case, looks like there's a arena or some type of building. Maybe you want to block your view from that sitting on your deck. So you want the tree, but it's in the power lines. Utility trims it back, and it's this just cycle of trim it back. It sends out new sprouts. Those branches aren't strong. They snap off in a windstorm. That's a problem. So experts agree, don't top a tree. It's not good for the tree. And as that bottom bullet says, just as a precaution or a safety, don't as a homeowner mess with power lines. Even the line from the pole to your home, you've got to be respectful of that and stay away from it. This is an alternative to that. Alternative to topping a tree would be to what they call a drop crotch. The center of the tree, the branches are cut out so that those wires can pass through there. It's a much healthier structure for the tree. Doesn't look grand, but at least the tree can now grow to its mature height and without interfering with those wires. And again, there's the website on the National Forest Service website on more information on drop crotching techniques. So when you're pruning a branch, a large branch in particular, this is important. What do we mean by large? Oh, maybe 1.5 inches, 2 inches, 3 inches, anything bigger than that. And the reason for that, this technique works so well, is because there's a lot of weight on that branch. Even without leaves on it, there's a lot of weight on that branch. When you're trying to cut it, as this saw cut is from underneath, it's going to eventually get weak enough in that cut, it's going to pinch your saw. So you can't cut the whole thing from the bottom. If you cut just from the top, it get maybe 3/4 of the way through, and then it's going to snap off and it's going to tear that bark down the trunk of the tree. You want to avoid that. So this technique works well. Picture the trunk of the tree over here on the left side. Over here, this is a branch that they want removed. So 10, 12, 16 inches out, you start a cut from the underside, and you're maybe going to cut 1/3 of the way. You don't want to cut too much because it'll pinch the saw, but maybe 1/3 of the way is going to be fine. And then your second cut, left the saw in here just so you could see where that cut is. A couple inches out beyond that, again, away from the trunk. You're going to saw through that. You probably won't get all the way through. It's going to get 2/3, 3/4 of the way, and this branch is going to snap off, similar to this one. Now you've removed the weight from that branch. It's kind of a controlled fracture, and that branch falls the way you want it to fall. So it's nice in that regard too. And then, so that's the second cut. And then the third cut, going to cut at that branch collar. because you don't have weight on there now, you can cut from the top or the bottom, or a lot of times you'll do a combination of both. You'll cut from the bottom so that you cut the bark and slightly in. And in this case, that branch is at enough of an angle he can get that saw, that single blade saw in there. A lot of times you can't get the blade in at the angle and you have no choice but to cut from the bottom or the outside. And in that case, if you can't get that angle quite right, you're either cutting it too deep, a flush cut, or you're going to damage that branch collar. So this is a nice technique for removing those large branches, getting the weight off the branch, and then you can make a nice, clean final cut there. It really works well. Pruning, moving on here, pruning, anytime you prune a tree, it stimulates new growth, particularly in fruit trees or trees growing for their flowers, magnolia or crab apples or what have you. It's going to stimulate some new growth, more flowering, and also thin out the center branches that tend to get crowded over time. Again, trees that blossom, when they blossom, it's because of sunlight penetrating in there. It's going to help. Air circulation is going to help reduce fungal diseases if a tree is prone to fungal diseases. More sunlight equals more flowers, and of course that leads to more fruit or more blossoms if it's just for the blossoms. And good air circulation, less fungal diseases. So timing for pruning, I think I mentioned this earlier. The dormant season, anytime in the dormant season, so when the leaves are off, is great. The tree is at rest. Late winter is optimal. And the reason for that is maybe obvious, but not always obvious. When we're pruning, we're creating an open wound on that tree. If you're doing it in late winter, then that tree is going to start growing shortly thereafter. Gets a head start on healing that wound over. We trim that same branch off in, let's say, in early November after the leaves have fallen off. That wound is exposed November, December, January, February, March until April or May when the tree starts to grow again. So that's why late winter is the ideal time. I'm going to mention it right now because I know it's on minds of a lot of people. This year with this exceptionally warm weather, typically March is kind of the calendar month of when late winter is and when you want to do pruning. This year we're probably a month earlier than that. Month of February would be ideal. This time would be ideal. No reason not to do it now. The weather is nice. It's pleasant out there. There's no snow on the ground. Easy access. And for the most part, the ground is frozen. If you're setting up a ladder or you're maybe hiring an arborist, a professional, and they can get in without tearing up your lawn. So ideal time right now in February. You want to avoid any extensive pruning from bud break. So when those buds start to open and through full leaf expansion, that's a bad time to be pruning a tree. It's a stressful time for that tree. The tree is putting all its energy into growing those new leaves, and by you pruning it, you're really going to upset that cycle. So when do you prune flowering trees and shrubs? You prune immediately after the flowering. So in the case of like a crabapple tree, which is growing for its colorful flowers, lilac would be another example. It's typically not a tree, more of a shrub, but you prune it after it. So it's going to bloom in the spring. You're probably going to be June or maybe into late July, early July to be pruning those branches. And the prime reason for that is because if you prune your crabapple tree or your lilacs in late March, you're pruning off those flower buds that have already developed last summer. If it's the only time to prune, it's fine. It's not that it's unhealthy for the tree. It's just that you're pruning off those blossoms, potential blossoms of the flower buds that are developed on there. If the tree is one that blooms, or the shrub in that matter, later in the summer or fall, you can prune that this time of year. Late winter or early spring is fine because those buds have not developed yet. They're going to develop early in the summer and then blossom after that. So quickly, we've got about 5 more minutes here, maybe 7 or 8. I always seem to go overtime. Quickly, I want to talk about tools. I think most people are familiar with these, but never hurts if you're not. I can talk about them. So a hand pruners would look like this. There's two types. This is showing an anvil or a bypass type. It's the two blades are like a scissor action. One goes past the other, and the other type would be an anvil type. It's like a knife against a breadboard. It's a one. The bottom one is a flat, blunt blade, if you will, and then the top sharp blade comes down against it. Bypass is most common. It cuts the cleanest. Likewise with the loppers, it can. This is a bypass here. It also comes in bypass or an anvil style. Looks essentially the same, but it has long handles on it to give you better leverage. Here's one with a gear action, a little what am I trying to say here? A mechanical advantage here. Because of this little gear setup, you've got maybe 2 to 3 times the cutting force with the same handle action. So a nice feature for giving you a little more oomph in your cut. Hand saw, this would be a pruning saw. Typically these are on the pull cut. You're cutting on the pull action rather than pushing. And the reason for that is the blade tends to be a little bit thinner, which is to your advantage of getting in between the branch and the trunk of the tree. And then the pulling action is the blade is not going to buckle as much. It's a relatively small saw. Maybe this one's, I don't know, 15 inches long end to end. Easy to use. Bow saw common. The blade is thinner, cuts easy, but you've got the bow to contend with. Cutting up firewood works great, but when you've got that bow hitting against another branch or the trunk of the tree, it can be an issue. So it's not ideal for pruning branches on that final cut. Just a word on, I thought there was one mention here of a pole saw. Well, the other option would be a pole saw, which is again maybe a 10, 12, 15, 18 foot. Some are telescoping so that you can stand on the ground and reach higher branches. So cleaning and maintenance, always sterilize pruning tools between trees when you're dealing with a disease such as fire blight. That's so that you don't, it's a bacterial disease. You don't want to spread it from one tree to the next or even one branch to the next. So use rubbing alcohol, not bleach. Now bleach works, but it's chlorine based, so it's corrosive. So we recommend you avoid bleach for that reason. A flame would work. If you've got a lighter in your pocket, you could run a flame over it. That would kill the bacteria as well. And then it behooves you to have those pruning tools sharp. They're going to cut better, less fatigue, and you're going to minimize damage. The tendency is when it's difficult to cut, you start twisting or rocking that pruners, and it can damage the bark. You want to avoid that. Damaged bark doesn't typically heal very well. And then oil occasionally to prevent rusting. So quickly, I won't go over these in great detail because we're running short on time, but it'll be in your notes. Oak wilt, problem with oaks. It's a fungal disease, as I think I mentioned earlier. It's spread by a sap beetle, so it's safe and recommended to prune your oak trees this year in February. Typically, it would be in March. You want to avoid pruning oaks in a typical year from 1st of April to 4th of July is kind of the rule of thumb. The recommendation nowadays is even later than that, maybe through September. And again, you want to avoid that spread of that disease, a fungal disease, by that sap beetle that going from a diseased tree to your tree. It's got an open wound. It's attracted to that fresh sap or the scent where that branch has been removed, and it's going to spread the disease. You want to avoid that. Dutch elm disease still around. It's kind of got away in a sense because we've lost virtually all of our elms. But as I mentioned on that list of trees to buy, there are quite a number of elms now that are available for purchase because they are resistant to Dutch elm disease. Again, it's another fungal disease. It is spread by an insect, as well as elm trees that are relatively close to each other, within the drip line of each other, the roots will commonly graft. Likewise with oak wilt, oaks that are close together, the roots will graft together. It spreads a disease. Unfortunately, it's also nature's way of kind of sharing the wealth. If one tree can get more moisture and nutrients, it can share with the tree adjacent to it. Emerald ash borer right now is out of control, particularly in the Twin City metro area, and I don't know the numbers offhand. It's It's probably not half yet, but many of the counties in Minnesota have emerald ash borer. It's a borer that these next three are all borers. They're insects. The adult lays their egg and it bores through the bark, and then it destroys the inner bark, which cuts off the circulation, so it eventually kills the tree. Emerald ash borer is only on ash trees, and that does not include mountain ash, but any green ash or black ash, which we've got tons of, particularly up north in the forest, a lot of black ash up there. So it's a really devastating disease. We want to avoid it. Bronze birch borer is only on birches, and two-line chestnut borer is again a borer that it typically attacks. We don't have many chestnuts around, but it does attack oak trees as well. So, and fire blight, I mentioned that one. It's a bacterial disease. The symptom there is the new growth tip on the fire blight is kind of that title there is descriptive. It looks like that branch got too close to a campfire and it's kind of wilted and bent over, and the leaves are browned out. So then those last two are evergreen diseases, Rhizosphaera needlecast. It loves the blue spruce from Colorado. It seems our atmosphere here is too humid and it's easily spread. And that typically starts in the lower branches. Lower branches turn yellow, lose their needles, and then it progresses up and up and up. The next one there, the Cystospora canker, is more random than that. A branch here and a branch there will get this canker. Branch itself will die. You can't control it by cutting out that branch. If it gets too extreme, you're going to have kind of a tree with some irregularity or asymmetry to it because you've trimmed out branches, but it doesn't necessarily kill the evergreen. And then I've got here, next to my last slide here, I've got 5 non-harmful tree conditions: burls, lichens, smooth patch, sooty mold, and wetwood. Nice to know that some of these things that might look alarming are not going to be harmful to the tree. We don't know what caused burls. It's kind of a mystery why trees get them, but they're not harmful to the tree. Lichens, typically lichens are a good sign. They only grow in areas with good clean air, no air pollution. So if you've got lichens on your tree, it's a sign that the air is clean. Smooth patch, again, this strange phenomenon where typically a mature tree like this has an area where the bark is just kind of smooth, but it's not into the tree tissue itself, so it's not harmful to the tree. Sooty mold, this is a mold that's feeding off of typically honeydew, that residue from aphids that have been feeding on the plant. It leaves this sugary sap called honeydew, whatever, and the mold is on that. But again, it's not into the leaf tissue itself, so it's not harmful to the tree. And then this wetwood, this one's kind of strange because it looks nasty, but it doesn't really harm the tree. It's a bacteria that's gotten in through a wound. In this case, a branch was removed. Could be in a smaller tree with a bumping it with a weed whacker or a lawnmower. You want to avoid that for this reason, but in this case, this does not kill the tree. So my last slide here, hiring an arborist. When it's necessary to hire an arborist, obviously pruning large trees. If you can't reach it from the ground, it's a safe bet that you should hire somebody that has a bucket lift or equipment to get up there and is trained to do that. Arborists are trained to do more than just trim branches and cut out trees. They're trained to diagnose, assess damage to a tree, assess diseases, insect damage to trees. So if you suspect some of those conditions, you can hire an arborist. If you have larger trees removed, and then pesticide applications. You can treat an ash tree or an oak tree to avoid emerald ash borer, oak wilt. You have to treat it before it gets the disease, but it can be treated. And arborists, I don't know that all of them are, but arborists that apply pesticides are licensed, and you should ask to see that license when hiring a professional. But you can go to that website and that publication, How to Hire a Tree Care Professional, give all the details. So quick summary, choose a tree that fits the site. Make sure it's not too big, too small. Make sure it likes The root, it's the soil, it is what it desires, whether it's wet soil or dry soil and such. Planting twice the width of the hole at 1 times the depth. Be sure to mulch it. Wood chips most common, and then some tree trunk protection in those younger years. Some fencing, hardware cloth or chicken wire, and then winter protection with that white tube. You can wrap trees. There's a wrap product I meant to mention that. It's kind of a crepe paper, impregnated crepe paper. Doesn't create that airspace between the trunk of the tree and the sunlight. So there's been examples where some of them just are not very effective. So I would avoid that myself. Again, water is important. We all know that first 3 years, right up till when the ground freezes, if it's dry. A lot of times in the fall, we get some rainy weather, so it's not necessary, but if it's dry like it was this last fall, you want to be sure to water right until that ground freezes. And then growth defects, codominant leaders, typically that's going to be a problem. You have that included bark, and then branches that might be a nice branch, but if it's too tight, that V-shaped crotch in it, it's going to be a weak branch. So you want to cut those out when the tree is small, and oftentimes it'll grow another branch that's at a better angle. And then pruning, where to cut, leave that branch collar and don't leave a stub. Stub either dies, as that one photo showed, or it's going to have a whole bunch of sprouts coming out of the end of that stub, which are not going to be very strong, and it's not going to be very desirable looking. And then I mentioned those tree diseases, and then getting help, hire arborist when necessary. With that, I can answer some questions. Pat, do we have any questions?
We do. So we have about 9 minutes left for questions. We'll do our best to get through them. Some of these I think you answered in your presentation. So the first question is, what fruit trees do well in Zone 5A?
So 5 would be south of here. Don't know that I can say right off the top of the head. Obviously, any that would do well here in Zone 4 would do well in Zone 5. I know apples need an extended cold period. I don't know how far south Zone 5 is, so I can't really answer that one very well. But definitely apple trees need a cold period. That's why apples are not growing in southern states. I don't know beyond that, plums or cherries or peach trees and such. Peach trees typically are marginal here, so I would guess Zone 5 would be great for peaches and apricots.
Okay, thank you. For how many years after planting a young tree should we put that white plastic tubing on during the winter?
That's a good question, yeah. When the bark is still smooth, I would say, so a maple tree and fruit trees, it's maybe 5 years. Oaks and other trees that have a more coarse, corky-like bark, not nearly as long. So when it's smooth bark, I'd say put that white tube on. And obviously, as the tree gets bigger, if the tree is bigger than that tube, it's not really doing the right purpose either. If it's too tight against the tree and it's starting to put pressure on that bark, so you can buy larger tubes. But yeah, good question.
Okay. Is there a way to remove included bark after the fact?
Good question. No, there's not. If it's in there, it's in there. It's only going to progressively get worse. That's why I say recognize it when the tree is small, like the one on the left there in that series of 3, and that's the time to remove it. There is a technique if you remove it. If that was the case and it was a codominant leader and you removed it and there were no branches on that side, there is a technique to induce a branch on that side, and that would be to look for a dormant budge, that little tick mark where a branch might grow, and just make a little saw cut above it, and that it'll induce that bud to grow out as a new branch. But yeah, once there's included bark in a joint, you're not going to be able to remove it.
Okay. So Ellerine asks, she said, we pruned lilac trees to the ground. There are many babies coming up between, maybe suckers. Will they mature into more lilacs?
Yes, It sounds like this is a lilac shrub form rather than a tree form, because there are lilac trees that are single trunk. It sounds like this is a shrub with maybe multiple stems. Yes, it'll come back, and yes, the first year or so they're going to just go straight, but they will eventually branch out and mature into a shrub. Good question.
Good. You mentioned this year, February is a great time to prune. You probably want to be finished with pruning by the end of February. Most years it's March. Does that hold true for a northern magnolia? When should a northern magnolia be trimmed? Winter, spring? It does flower in the spring.
It flowers in the spring, so you're going to prune it after it flowers, so early summer.
Early summer?
Typically a magnolia doesn't need a lot of pruning, but if it does need some, if it's, you know, lopsided or asymmetrical, then you could trim a branch or so a little bit. Yep, so early summer after it blooms, right?
Yeah. And what I heard you say is this year, February, is probably late winter. Could you still prune trees into March this year, do you think? Or
Yes. Yeah, specifically February, end of February is kind of the deadline for oak trees, which are prone to oak wilt, which is again spread by that. It's a fungal disease spread by an insect. So if you're pruning apples or other trees, maples, yeah, you could do those later. Now, I didn't mention it with maples, which is kind of interesting because you trim a maple branch off in the spring and it's going to weep sap. The research shows it does not hurt the tree, but it sure hurts. It pulls on your heartstrings because you see all that sap dripping on that tree and you think you're stressing the tree, but the research shows it's not harmful. If for peace of mind that bothers you, you can wait till after it leaves out in maybe early June and prune your maples. But the research shows you can prune them now, yeah, before they leaf out.
or collect it and make syrup, right?
Yeah, there you
go. Do you paint or seal the cut after removing a branch? Do you put anything on it?
Good question. Typically, the answer is no, you don't need to. And they sell products for that. It's not necessary. The one exception is oaks. If you have storm damage or an open wound, fresh cut wound in that April 1st to July 4th time frame, you want to paint that immediately, like within 5 minutes. With any paint would work. Latex paint works fine. You could use a shellac or varnish or whatever you had, but you want to heal that over again so that that insect is not attracted to it. That's the one exception. Most trees are going to heal just fine without painting them or treating them.
Okay. And then the last question I see, when are dead branches at the canopy concerning?
Dead branches at the canopy. As a rule of thumb, you can remove a dead branch anytime. That's not the question. The question is when it would be a concern. I'd say if it's a large branch, to where it'll fall, or maybe it's broken and it's a dead branch. If it's large enough to where it bonked you on the head, it would be a problem, or fell on your car, it would be a problem. I hope that's the answer they were looking for, or I got that question right.
Okay. Yeah, that's all the questions we have right now.
Kind of as a follow-up to that, it's real common for deciduous trees to lose some inner branches that are so shaded. That's their natural mode. So it's not uncommon to have some smaller branches, an inch or so small. It's typical, but dead inside the crown of the tree. So those I wouldn't be concerned about. They're not big enough to cause a lot of damage. But if you got a 2-3 inch diameter branch that's dead up there, it could snap off in a storm and hurt your car or hurt somebody.
Okay. Is under 30 degrees temperature-wise too cold to prune?
No, not at all. You can prune at 20 below if your fingers can stand it.
It's more about when it gets too warm.
Yes, and particularly those diseases that are spread in humid conditions. There's one that's on locust trees that likes the humidity, so you want to avoid the days that are 90 degrees and 90% humidity, like late August. But I didn't talk about those too much. It's not a big problem, but it is a problem.
Hannah says that was wonderful. Thank you. And
the timing worked. We had just enough questions to fill the time without.
So thank you so much, Paul, for all that wonderful information. And thank you everyone for attending tonight. After the webinar, you'll receive a survey. We always really appreciate it if you would fill that out and complete it, and provide your feedback so that we can continue to improve and seek out speakers and topics that are of interest to you. You'll receive an email within the next 24 to 48 hours with a link to the recording of tonight's webinar and the notes from Paul. On behalf of the Minnesota State Horticultural Society and our presenter, thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you back soon. Good night.
Thanks, Pat.
You're welcome.